Everybody for joining. We are going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to our Build Better Operations Build-along. We're going to spend some time today talking about how to take data that you might have trapped in spreadsheets and use Retool to help your operations team be faster and more efficient. I'm Keenan. I'm a technical product marketing manager at Retool, and I want to welcome you all to our event. We had a ton of registrations for today, so thanks everybody for registering and taking time out of your day to join us here. Like I mentioned before, we have Christina and Nate from Retool also running the room, and you'll see them in the chat answering questions from folks. But we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions or anything specifically that you're hoping that we cover, please don't hesitate to drop those in the chat, and either Nate or Christina will get to those questions, or we will get to them at the end. So yeah, over there on the right-hand sidebar is where we have our chat and our Q&A section. So feel free to use those. We'll just get going here. Let's get started. So what's the problem that we're going to be talking about today? Well, operations teams need data. They oftentimes have a lot of it, and they need a way to work with it. And so this data is a lot of times stored in a central database where operations folks need to ask engineering teams to run queries for them or get specific slices of data that they need. And engineering team and the security folks don't want to just give read access to the entire database. And so what this ends up looking like is oftentimes requests come into engineering for queries get run, turn into spreadsheets, and then those spreadsheets are kind of what's floating around. Things like those spreadsheets being out of sync with production data, or you get a spreadsheet that gets passed around and modified, and you end up with file names like data final, things like that. So we want to avoid all of that and look at how we can easily kind of take that spreadsheet data, turn it back into an application that's actually useful, connected to real live functional data, and how to kind of manage that build from beginning to end. So while spreadsheets are incredibly useful, they're not always the best way to solve this kind of data problem that operations teams have. And so that's where Retool comes in. Like you can see here, Retool is the fastest way to build internal software. And we're going to take a look at how that happens in a few different ways. Number one, we're going to look at resources and basically where data comes from when you're building with Retool, whether that's a spreadsheet or a database you already own. The next thing we're going to look at is kind of the app builder experience, basically the UI that we put on top of that data. And we're going to look at kind of the workflow and the developer experience that ties all of those pieces together. So the process of connecting resources into your app, looking at those different slices of data in different ways. And this is what Retool specifically helps with. So the first thing when we start on any project like this is to think about where is our data, right? So in Retool, the concept of data is represented by what we call resources. Resources are essentially any data source, whether that's an API connecting to a database, an S3 bucket, or things like Retool database and Retool storage, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. Basically, connecting your own data into Retool is what really makes it the most useful. We have a ton of components and cool UI things that you can build with, but where internal apps and tools get really powerful is when you can connect your own data. So if you already have a Postgres database, a MySQL database, anything like that, you can very easily connect those as resources in Retool. But where we see a lot of folks get stuck is they want to build an internal app, they have a spreadsheet, but they aren't able to kind of go through the process of getting that database connection right away. And so that's where we're going to start today. We are going to show how Retool can still be useful if you're starting with a spreadsheet, and it can be useful to kind of build up that UI, figure out what sort of app you want to build, and then once you've got that app functional and working, then you can actually, without very many changes, hook that data up to your real live database. So to support kind of this spreadsheet to app model, Retool offers a tool called Retool DB, which is essentially, it's a managed Postgres database, and you can create tables and fields and modify the data like you would with a spreadsheet. So let's start there. We're going to go into our Retool DB instance. And basically, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be looking at what an operations team for a software company might deal with, where we have various sales data and some different affiliates who are promoting our different products with their unique promo codes. We want to be able to kind of slice that data up and use it in a couple different ways. So right now we have two CSV files that we're going to import. So you can see if you go up to Retool DB here, you can import CSV. We're going to import it into a new table. And I'm just going to grab our sales data. And you can see that when we drop our CSV in here, it automatically detects all of our columns. It suggests field types and all of these things. So really, with very little configuration, I can create a table inside of Retool DB with my CSV data. So you see here that it's all imported. And now that this is in Retool DB, if you needed to kind of make any modifications or adjustments, you could do that in an interface that looks very similar to a spreadsheet. So it's an interface you're definitely already familiar with. But that data is now in here. So we're going to do that one more time for our kind of affiliate promotional data. And you can see again, it created the fields that I needed from my CSV, and we can just go ahead and create table. So now we have two tables, essentially our sales data with information about who's buying which of our plans. And then we also have our table of affiliates with a little bit more information about them and their particular promo code, which will come in handy a bit later. So now that our data is inside of Retool, we actually need to do something with it and build a UI for it. So that's where our app builder comes in. This is Retool's app builder. So you can see right now we're kind of starting out with a blank canvas, but we do have all of Retool's components over here that we can add. So these are, if you've ever used a drag and drop kind of editor before, we can start to do that. But we're also going to take a look at how this can be a whole lot more powerful than just drag and drop. So we're going to give some idea of what we're building here. Just a little title element, sales dashboard. These text components do support Markdown. So you can use any sort of Markdown styling you're familiar with here, or you can just make it plain text. Next, we're going to use one of Retool's more powerful components, which is called our table component. So if we drag and drop this table component here, we can see that it gets populated with a bunch of test data, which is useful to kind of see how the table component works and how it's going to look in our layout. But what's really powerful, like we said, is when we connect our own data to it. So we can click on this badge right here, connect your data. And this is when we can look at creating a new query to pull in our Retool data. So we're going to specify that we want to use the Retool database resource. And then we can write our query in here. Let's just continue so we get this in a full state. So now that we're querying from Retool DB, we can just run a select star on our table, which if we bounce back over here, we called it BA_sales. And if we save and run, you see that it gives us a preview of our data here. And then it pulls the data into that table. So it still has our kind of test columns in here. So what we want to do is basically just regenerate the column names from the data that we actually have so it matches our data. And just like that, we have a table that is pulling from Retool DB. So we can modify this a little bit. We don't necessarily care about things like displaying the ID, even though that was present in the database. So we can click on the ID and set hidden to true. And we can also do things like if we really want the plan to be the first column that people see, we can drag it. And basically this table is entirely modifiable. You can double click on column headings to adjust the spacing of them, just like you would in Excel or any other spreadsheet tool. Let's say we want, our organization to be next to our customer name. So we can do a lot of tweaking in here to make the data look the way we want it. And because this is a fully interactive table, after we've gotten it set up, we can do things like sorting. So if we want to see the most recent purchase in here, we can do that. We also have the ability to use these buttons down here, which you may be familiar with these icons. This first one is filter. So if we wanted to, for example, show only free plan users, that would be a way to do that. And then this table gets filtered down to only free plan users. So you can see this has similar elements to what you might build in a spreadsheet, but it's already a lot more powerful. In addition to this kind of filtering functionality, you can also at any point download an actual file version of this. So even though your data is in Retool and it's a little bit more powerful in a spreadsheet, if you do need to export it out to a spreadsheet, you can do that very easily from within this interface that we're building. Cool. So let's make this a little bit more useful. So we have all of our data here now. But one thing we can also do is if we're saying, we have enterprise plan and free plan, let's say that something our operations team is dealing with is the launch of a new plan called the business plan. So you can see that we have a plan that is business in here. We have some customers on it, but we want to look and be able to very quickly see like what the adoption is looking like on this, if people are using it, if people are signing up for it, that sort of thing. So what we can do is we can use another one of Retool's components, the chart component. And if we pull that in here, Retool will do its best to guess what sort of data we want, which based on kind of the queries we've set up and all that stuff. But does not look like kind of the data that we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's look at a pie chart instead. And instead of the labels here for the date, we're going to do plan. So just in a couple clicks, this gives us a very nice visual breakdown of how our different plans are set up and distributed across our customers. So we can add a title here to say that as well. But you can see that enterprise, is about 40% of our customers here in this example. Business is a little bit less with 33, and our free plan is only 27% of users. And we just kind of took the defaults here. But for example, if we wanted to really call out the business plan, we could go in here and say, no, we really want that to be orange. You can change all these colors and use any of these elements of the UI that are helpful to kind of customize this chart to make it useful. The other thing that you can do is if you really need to go further, the graphing and charting underneath is using plotly.js. And so if you want to write the JSON yourself or get it generated by some other tool, you can just copy paste that into here. And that JSON will be what's used to generate your chart. So the UI is a really quick way to get started. If you need even more customizability, you can access all the features of Plotly using the Plotly JSON. Great, so now we have a table that has been generated from our spreadsheet. We can filter it, we can download it, and we also have a breakdown of exactly who's using which plan. So we see that the usage is actually pretty even. It looks like our free plan is the least, but we can easily see over time, as more data comes in, how this starts to change, which is pretty helpful. And so already this is becoming a pretty useful dashboard, especially when taking into account that multiple people can access this. You can share this with your team, and everybody can kind of centralize on this sort of view. So you're not worrying about passing different spreadsheet files back and forth, or wondering if someone has the latest updated version of the data. Once all this data is in Retool and this dashboard is updated in essentially real time as new data comes in, it becomes even more useful. So let's start to take a look at some of this affiliate data, right? We have all these sales here that some of them have promotional codes associated with them, et cetera. And one of the really powerful things that you can do in Retool that you can't necessarily do as easily in a spreadsheet is respond to events that happen. So we do these through something called event handlers in Retool, and we're going to take a look at exactly how that works. What we want to do here is when we click on a particular transaction row in our table, we want some information about this affiliate, which we can pull from the other table that we imported to Retool DB. So let's do that here. We're just going to put a text element here, and we're going to call this affiliate info. Let's make it a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on here. Cool. And then we're going to use one of Retool's components that's called key value. Basically, this is useful for displaying kind of a heading and then a piece of data, and then another heading and another piece of data. So you can see, again, it's populated with some sample content. We're going to clear that out for now, and we're going to write a new query. So this query here, we're going to call get sales data. That's the one we already have written. But we need a new query now for getting the selected affiliate. And what's cool in Retool is that even though there is a ton of capability that's accessible just by dragging and dropping UI, using the pre-built components, you can also basically write code anywhere and extend these components in such a way that they work for you and not something you're having to fight against. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to run a database query to grab data from the affiliates table, which is here, and it shows more information about the different affiliates. But we only want to use the affiliate that is in the selected row. So what we can do is we can say select star from BA promo, which it autofills that as a table name because we know that's there. But again, getting all of the data from the table is not exactly what we want. So what we can say is where and then affiliate promo code equals, and this is where we can pull in anywhere when these double curly brackets is something else from some other Retool component or to something in the UI builder. So what we can do is we can say table1 dot selected row, and then you can see it's kind of showing us what our selection is here. And so we want to ask it for the promotional code. So basically, grab the affiliate from the promo table where the promo code is whatever's in this column here. So if we save and run this query, you can see nothing is there because there's no promo code. But when we pick a row that has a promo code, you see that, okay, now we're actually pulling in our affiliate data, which is pretty cool. So what we can do then is go back to our key value and say, we really want the data from our get selected affiliate query to be populated into here. And so you can see that now it's pulling this affiliate data. And if we click another row with an affiliate, it actually reruns. And so you can see that this query right here is set to run when inputs change, which means Retool automatically knows to watch this table1 dot selected row. And when a different row is selected, it automatically reruns the query and automatically populates this new component. There's no concept of having to manually manage state or having to manually kind of rerun or reflow things because Retool can handle that all for you. And you can set up relatively complicated dependencies actually between components and queries, and those things will automatically run. And again, this component, we wrote some code to get this populated, but now we can go back to just like we did before. If we wanted to, for example, hide this ID column, we could do that. Reorder these however we wanted to, and all this is kind of possible inside the UI builder now, but we've written some code to get that going. So another thing that is useful for this kind of logic is like cleaning up when, for example, if we don't have a component selected, obviously we won't have any data in the key value, but we probably don't want this text to display either. So this hidden attribute, which we've used a couple times already today, in addition to just being true or false, you can use our double curly brackets again to have a condition that's based on a variable. So for example, we could say, table1 dot selected row dot ID, right? So if there is an ID, we want this to show. We actually want the inverse of that. So if there's no ID, we want it to be hidden. So basically, you can see that now it is conditional. The logic is conditional on whether the currently selected row has a promotional code, which is nice because that just lets our interface be a little bit cleaner and only display when that information is relevant. So the hidden attribute is not just the true or false, it's any variable or any Retool attribute that evaluates to a true or false kind of Boolean as far as JavaScript is concerned, can power this hidden attribute, which makes it really powerful. So now we've got kind of a basic readout of our affiliate info, but really what would be more interesting here is if we could get, sort of a leaderboard of, okay, who are the top affiliates? How are they, driving purchases of our different plans? So let's take a look at that. Let's get rid of this affiliate info stuff for now because we want to really be able to show a bunch of our affiliate data here. So again, now that all these components are in place and they're actually pulling data, you can spend kind of as much time as you'd like reordering things and kind of getting the layout the way you want it to. And it all just kind of works and reflows. So we'll just adjust this a little bit here. We will do our reverse chronological search. Cool. And so we are ready to put another table in here. So what we want to do here is we want to build an affiliate leaderboard, basically rank the affiliates based on how many sales each of these kind of individual promotional codes is driving. And so what we can do is we can write a query that does that. If we go back over here to our query editor, we can add a new query, which again, we want it to pull from Retool DB. And this is a slightly more complex query than the one we've written before. So I'm just going to copy paste this in here. We want to make sure that our table names line up. And if we save and run, we can see that now we have our affiliates ranked by how many times their particular promotional code was used. So we're going to call this query rank affiliates. And we can use our new table here to display the results of this query. Right, so we have the promotional code, the affiliate name, and the usage count. Right, so again, this is the same table component we've used before. So if we want to, sort this the other way and see, which of the affiliates are, referring less purchases to us than we would expect, we can rank it that way too. But again, this is kind of just like these two different slices of looking at the same data. And we can do all of that inside of Retool and look at data in kind of any way we want. And again, if this is useful to certain people on the team, they can download this as a CSV or filter by only affiliates that they care about or things like that. So you could do something like only filter by where usage count is greater than 3, and that trims down your table pretty significantly. But this is just, again, another way you can kind of slice and dice this data to make it useful to people who are trying to get actual information out of your data and insights out of your data, as opposed to spending all day scrolling through and staring at CSVs. So there's a lot more that you could do here now that you have this this dashboard built out. Like again, like I mentioned, you can really, one of the most powerful things you can do is invite your other team members. So that kind of keeps everyone on the same page in terms of knowing what data to look at, where the data is, and where it lives. And now, again, that you have this UI built, this is the time where a lot of times we see people use a tool like Retool DB to get going very quickly and figure out what kind of tool they need to build. But very easily, you could take these table and these queries, and instead of querying Retool DB, you could hook it up to your own, MySQL or Postgres instance, and that would make these tables even more powerful because it'd be pulling in like real-time sales data and refreshing kind of as soon as there was new data available. And so you can build these kind of relatively complex, like real-time dashboards after you've gotten going and figured out what you need to build and how you want it to look. And so um, there's a lot more that you can do here, but I hope this has been a little bit helpful just to see kind of how you can very quickly get going with spreadsheets, use Retool's built-in components to make that data a little bit more useful and helpful, and display it and slice it up in a few different ways. So um, again, we want to leave some time for Q&A, so I think we're going to move into that now. But yeah, if you have any kind of questions that we didn't cover, please leave them in the chat. And I hope this is helpful. So we will jump into Q&A. Let's see. So Matthew asked, any tips on this use case? Should I create one single app for multiple clients, or should I create a separate app for each? Each client has the same data connectors, the queries are the same, and I just need to be able to dynamically change the resource based on which client logged in. Yes, that's a good question. So there's a couple different ways you can think about to architect that, depending on, honestly, a lot of it depends on your preference. So if it's easier for you to create different apps for different clients, just to keep things separate, Retool does offer, folders and things outside of the app builder interface to keep things organized for you. And also, you can take queries that you've written and extract them to Retool's query library, which basically gives you a common set of queries to pull from, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every app. So if that's kind of how your brain works and what you want to, how you want to break things up, you won't necessarily have to kind of reinvent the wheel with every one of those apps. You'll still be able to have the concept of shared logic. You can basically create groups of components known as modules in Retool and reuse those across apps. So there's definitely an element of that, of the shared logic, that you can reuse there, and that can keep it a little bit simpler if resources are changing kind of per application. Michael asks, can you import CSV files directly from an S3 bucket? At the moment, I don't believe so, but if you do have kind of ETL needs like that, where you want to like take data in from some other source and transform it a bit before it gets into Retool. Retool does have a solution called Workflows for that, which basically lets you um, do whatever you need to with visual kind of steps in here. So taking data from S3, doing any sort of transformations that are necessary, and then importing it into a Retool DB like we showed here would be a great way to use workflows if you do need to pull from S3 or some other data source like that. Can you speak to, Benjamin asks, can you speak to the merits of doing the approach you've overviewed here versus using something like Google Sheets to be able to also have real-time data available within a spreadsheet tool? Yeah, Google Sheets is definitely another option for doing something like this, especially if what you need is basically a chart and some data next to it. I think that where Retool becomes a much better option than Google Sheets is talking about some of the things like that we're talking about going beyond this pretty basic example. So if you want to push this data out to Slack or take in data from more than just a database, if you want to start incorporating things like data from Salesforce so that you could know who this organization is, how much they've talked to the sales team, et cetera. Incorporating more of those data sources and things like that is something that Retool is really great at and does out of the box, whereas you would have a much more difficult time doing something like that in Google Sheets. Cool. Kunal asks, could tools be created in a B2B multi-tenant setting where individual users tied to different tenants could be shown data from their own linked data sources? Yeah, so this is something that is actually we're going to be pushing out very soon. We're launching the concept of Retool portals, which basically gives you that sort of multi-tenant user-specific experience. But already in Retool, you can use things like that conditional logic inside of curly braces that we talked about earlier to kind of personalize this view for specific folks based on who the users are that are logged in. Um, so if you're talking about specific users that are internal to your company, being able to view data that's specific to them, you can definitely already do that in Retool. If you're talking about wanting to invite external users and let them see data, that's something that we're going to be able to talk about more very soon. Pierre asks, what would be the difference between using components, no-code filters, and updating our query with the proper where argument? Um, it's a good question, and I don't know that I'll be able to address all of that, but I hope to address a lot of it. So the table component, like as it drops in, is kind of gives you the default query, and by default, it shows everything that you've written in the query here. So if you have like a particular slice of the data that you want to show by default when this component loads, that's probably when you would want to write it into the query. If you don't really know what people are going to want to see and you want to just write the query to be a little bit more general, but let people see what data is kind of useful to them, that's where using the filters, especially for people who aren't familiar with writing SQL, is really helpful. Like, for example, you could put, plan includes free, like we talked about. You could write this into the query, but that would kind of limit the output of this table to only the free plan, which if that's what you wanted, that would be fine. But if you want to make it a little more flexible and let people do the filtering themselves, that's where using the filtering comes in. Stephanie asks, can you upload a CSV file via the upload button, format this CSV via the table component, and send it automatically to update the Retool database? So I think what you're talking about is using kind of our import CSV like we did here, and format it via the table component, and then send it back to Retool database. If you need to format the data or change the data once you've imported it, this kind of Retool DB interface is where you're going to want to do that. I'm not quite sure what you're talking about through formatting it via the table component, but you can edit and do any sort of data updates you need to here after you import it. And then there's no separate sync step. Like as soon as you make a change here and hit save, it's updated in Retool DB, which would then reflect here any components that were using that underlying data automatically. Matthew asks, does the hidden feature improve the app performance in any way? I think it would really depend on like how many components you have on the page as to whether you would notice it. But yeah, it does, remove it from the render flow of the app itself. And so, in addition to just visually cleaning it up, there would probably be some performance improvement, but it would be difficult to say like how many. You need a lot of components on the page to notice that probably. The engineering team behind Retool spends a lot of time working on kind of performance improvements for all components across the board, and so um, I would be surprised if you would notice the performance improvement from hiding one component, but it definitely helps to have it hidden. Would the same flow follow if we were to use Airtable as a database? Yeah, so basically, the idea behind using a database in Retool and displaying it in a table component, the idea of Retool resources is that you can use essentially any API, database, or any other backend that you might have to populate these sorts of dashboards. So, again, you would just need to slightly modify the query to pull from Airtable as opposed to Retool database. Retool, as we mentioned here with resources, we have a lot of connections and integrations to resources already. But if there's one that you need to use that's not supported, as long as it has an API or some other way that you can connect to it, you can do that in Retool. You can just hit it as a REST API or as a SOAP API or something similar to that. So it would be a very similar flow. You would just need to update your queries to connect to Airtable instead of pulling from Retool DB. Alternatively, if you wanted to do something like that with the ETL, like Retool workflows piece, you could write a workflow that imported data from Airtable and synced it into Retool DB every so often. If you didn't want to connect to Airtable directly, that's an option you could have as well. Colleen asks, if you have sheets that are essentially relational, can Retool automatically set up those relationships, or do you need to handle setting IDs prior to importing the CSVs? Good question. Yeah, the Retool does its best to guess at kind of how your data is set up. So like you saw when we imported the CSVs here, it knew like what kind of data types things were. It kind of looked at the CSVs that way. As far as creating relations dynamically between data that you've imported, I don't believe we support that right now. What I will say, something that might interest you, is you'll notice that when we were doing these queries here, there's this little Ask AI widget down here. And the Ask AI basically pops up like, okay, you can ask it whatever you want it to do. And it is aware of all your various data tables and columns and the kind of the schema of your data, how it looks. And so it can help you create those relations and do things like, our affiliate table query. It could look at, okay, we have sales data and affiliate data, and I want to correlate them. And I actually used it to help me write this relatively complex query here. So that's definitely something to look into if you need some help putting your queries together and all you have is flat CSV data. Another reason to use something like Retool over just using CSVs is that those relationships are a little bit harder to quantify sometimes if it's just a CSV file or a set of CSV files. And so getting into something that's an actual database like Retool DB is a good way to go. But yeah, definitely take a look at that Ask AI feature if you need help kind of defining those relationships. Yeah, Bison asks, is it more or less difficult to use an API as a data source instead of a database? Do you have any recommendations for resources on how to do this? I think it just depends, like your comfort with making REST API calls, whether there's already a Retool connector for it, and just like what you're actually trying to access. So, obviously, like if you're comfortable writing SQL, like using Retool DB is relatively straightforward. As you saw, kind of most of the output of Retool queries is usually some type of array or object. So that's very similar to what what APIs return as well. So as far as like the components to use a database response versus an API response, there's not a ton of difference. One thing I will say is that if your API doesn't give you an array similar to what the table component is expecting, you can use this transform results piece here, where you can actually write whatever sort of transformations in JavaScript that you want to. So in addition to what you get back from your API call or database query, you can transform those results into whatever shape you need them to be to show up in the component that you rely on. So it depends on a few different things, notably like whether there's a built-in Retool connection for it, um, what sort of quality of data the API returns and things like that. But the idea is that it should be a pretty seamless and similar experience no matter where you're pulling, just because of how you can write things in the query interface. Cool. John says, how do you choose which roles and users have the ability to access this page? Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a little bit, I think, outside of the scope of what we're showing here, but basically, Retool has lots of different controls and permissioning for, to basically get as granular as you want around who has access to certain apps, who has access to run certain queries, um, things like that. So it's definitely something that you can configure once you have your app built out, and something that you can build organizational rules and things around as well, so that the people who need to see your information can, and people who don't want to have access to it don't have that ability. Oscar asks, yeah, what about data uploads from Retool to other systems? Are there built-in connectors? Yeah, so we covered this a little bit, but there definitely are. You can go to the Retool docs on resources to see what we have here in terms of resources that you can connect to. But there are, a ton of different integrations that we have out of the box. And again, if an integration you need is not something we currently support, as long as that tool has an API, you can make a REST API or a SOAP API request to that to pull in that as a data source. Andrew says, can you set up event hooks such as notifications in Slack when your app database gets updated or deleted? Yeah, so we do have a Slack connector that you can use to get notifications about things that happen in the app, whether that's having a button that someone can click here to manually send a notification message, or just basically responding to events that happen. You can do those through event handlers here in Retool, which we didn't really go into, but you can basically respond to any sort of event in your app. Um, and you can either show stuff in your app, you can run scripts, you can control components, control queries, which is what you would need to use to send a message into Slack, and even something as simple as making a nice little confetti image, which is kind of cool. So now every time we select a row, we see that event happens, and we get some confetti on the screen. So you can definitely connect things essentially in any configuration that you'd like. And Slack is a connector that we support and use all the time for stuff like that. Have you ever had customers create a complex single page app with no page reloads by using modules and changing component views instead of creating individual apps and linking those apps via the nav? Yeah, so the question basically boils down to like, could you do a very complex app with no page reload just by hiding and showing components? And you definitely could. I think you'd want to just make sure that all the various queries and stuff running in the background, that you were very efficient about um, you know only running queries when you really need to. If you add more components that run queries automatically, you make those dependencies more complicated. That's when like you start to see some performance hits because things are running when they don't need to, etc. But if you're really observant about that and diligent about that, you definitely could have a single page app with no um, kind of navigation component. I will say, if you noticed before, when we had those components that were hidden, when you do have different components hidden, um, it does kind of make the clickable area to select this component down to just that one little tab there. So if you had a ton of components that were stacked on top of each other, you may start to have issues as a builder of this application, like clicking on the component that you want, selecting it, etc. Um, but it's definitely something you could do. I will also say that the folks on the engineering team are continuing to make navigating between Retool apps and having the concept of like multi-page apps much more performant, and continue to make improvements there. So um, I do think that makes the case a bit stronger for wanting to divide things up by pages. But if you wanted to have a bunch of components on a single page and just kind of hide show them, you definitely could. But just make sure you're looking at what queries are running and things that are running automatically, and you have kind of a good handle on that. Cool. Yeah, I think we've got a couple more here. Nick asks, if you create a module of a set of components, does that inherently include the queries those components are powered by? So we talked about we just briefly touched on modules as basically a reusable combination of components. So this is most frequently used in things like building a navigation bar that you want to include in like every app that's connected to that navigation bar. Um, and so you can definitely do that because there are groups of components. yeah, the queries and everything else that powers those individual components come with them. So it's really best for like when you want to create an entirely reusable section of your app, so that you're not having to duplicate logic and duplicate queries and things like that across multiple different spaces. Let's see. Is there a way to create a second page that would display all of a single customer's details when you select one from the top table? For sure. You could create that as a separate app where you could click in and like view customer details. We also, like I said, have a bunch of different components that can let you do things like that. So we do have a modal component where you could pop something over the top that kind of shows that. You could also have a sidebar that slides out from the side. That's kind of that detail component. So that's that drawer, this drawer frame here, and the modal frame. So you see that if we have the drawer frame and we drag it here, this is where we could we could do our same kind of logic around selected customer details, etc. Um, and so, we can have this basically clicking on a row, you could have it trigger this slide out and do, more detailed data views in there. So the modal and the sidebar frame are pretty good ways to accomplish that. Cool. And then we've got time for just a couple more here. Um, is there any single solution to create a flexible view between mobile and the web, except check the mobile view in every component? That's a good question, and something the team is definitely working on and taking a look at. Retool right now kind of has two separate products. One which is Retool Mobile. So if you're looking to create mobile applications and that sort of stuff uh, that use things like Retool DB, and you love this kind of tool building process, but it needs to be a mobile app, you can use Retool Mobile for that. For the kind of web desktop apps, we do have, as you noted, like kind of mobile toggles and things in here to look at like how things look on mobile to hide show certain things on mobile. But that is something that you kind of have to go through and build that experience with that kind of mobile view in mind. There's no way to do that in bulk right now. Yeah, so two more questions here. One, what are best practices to clean and normalize data and apply to unified taxonomy from multiple sources into Retool? Yeah, this is definitely where I would recommend something like Retool workflows, where if data is coming from a bunch of different sources, you want to make sure that it's going to fit into whatever schema you've introduced into your database, and so that probably needs a little bit more like ETL sort of motion before it's ready to be used in Retool. So that's not a Retool specific problem. There's definitely lots of resources online to look at kind of how you want to set up your data schema. But once you have that schema set up, whether it's in Retool DB or some other database, if you're pulling data from multiple sources that don't quite all match that schema, that's where I would suggest something like Retool workflows to get that data all in the same shape before it comes in. And we'll do the last one here. New to Retool here, welcome. Are there any outgoing connections? So for example, once the database is populated, can these lines be used to create a Jira ticket? Absolutely. So again, we covered this a little bit, but queries are not just inbound. You can also have queries that do things outside of Retool. So for example, if we wanted to add a button here in this row that said, we wanted to be able to send an email to this person and say, congratulations, like, thank you for being, one of our top affiliates. We could have a resource query that instead of pulling from the database, used Retool Email, which is Retool's built-in email sending tool. And so whether it's email or Slack or making REST API calls to something like Jira, you can definitely do all of that using Retool queries. These are not by any means read-only queries. You can do a ton here. Cool. Well, we are just about at time here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Like folks have mentioned in the chat, there will be a recording available that we'll make sure to get sent out to you. We will also be, posting a follow-up post in our Retool community. So if you have not checked out the Retool community, please do. We have lots of people jumping in there, helping, showing cool things they've built with Retool. And it's a great place to kind of learn more about all the stuff that we've talked about today. And specifically, if you have even more questions that we didn't get a chance to cover, that's a good place to drop those in. But thanks everybody for coming. I hope this was helpful and you have some ideas about how you can upgrade your spreadsheets a bit and get some of this functionality we saw here today and put our claim of Retool being the fastest way to build internal tools to the test. Thanks, everybody.